Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Nikolai Dzhumagaliev. We begin our journey in the heart of Eurasia, within the vast, undulating expanse of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. It is January 1979. Imagine a landscape where the horizon is a blurred line of charcoal gray and bone white. The air is so cold it feels brittle, as if the very breath leaving your lungs might shatter like glass before it hits the ground. In the village of Uzunagach, the winter is not just a season, it is a weight. The houses are low-slung, their chimneys exhaling thin ribbons of wood smoke that hang motionless in the frozen air. Beyond the village, the Transilya-Latau Mountains rise like sleeping giants, their jagged peaks shrouded in a perpetual crystalline mist. Here, the silence is profound, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of boots on packed snow or the distant, lonely howl of the wind across the steppe. It is a place of deep stillness, a place where secrets can be buried under layers of permafrost, waiting for the inevitable, treacherous thaw. The year 1979 brought with it a strange atmospheric shift. While the winter remained harsh, there were moments when the temperature would lean toward a softening, a deceptive warmth that hinted at the coming spring. This was the thaw of 1979. In the village, life moved with a predictable Soviet cadence. Men worked at the railway or the local fire station, and women tended to the domestic hearth or the collective farms. Among them was Nikolai. He was a man of 26 years, a firefighter by trade, known for his well-pressed uniforms and his quiet, almost detached demeanor. He had returned to his birthplace in 1977 after years of wandering the Soviet Union, from the naval ports of Murmansk to the rugged Ural Mountains. To his neighbors, he was simply Kalia, a reliable worker who kept his boots polished and his face clean-shaven. But beneath the facade of the dutiful Soviet citizen, a dark transformation was nearing its completion. The resentment he carried, fueled by past rejections and the lingering physical toll of illness, was beginning to crystallize into a singular, predatory urge. On the evening of January 24th, 1979, the sky over Uzunagach was a deep, bruised purple. The light was fading fast, casting long, distorted shadows across the rural paths that connected the small settlements. A young woman named Dzhumagaliev was walking home. She was only 17 years old, a member of the local Seventh-day Adventist community, known for her quiet grace and her steady walk. The path she took stretched between the village and the nearby settlement of Mabulak. It was a lonely stretch of road, flanked on one side by the frozen banks of the Uzunagach River and on the other by a desolate landscape of shrubs and a local landfill. The ground was a mosaic of ice and frozen mud, and the only sound was the rustle of dry reeds shivering in the wind. Najda moved quickly, her coat wrapped tight against the chill, unaware that she was being watched. Nikolai would later describe this night not as a crime, but as his first hunt. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, primal rhythm that matched the pace of his footsteps as he began to close the distance between them. The transition from hunter to predator was silent and swift. In the dim light of the landfill, where the discarded remnants of village life lay frozen under a dusting of snow, the unthinkable occurred. Nikolai approached from the darkness, his movements calculated and precise. He would later recount how he placed his arm around her neck, dragging her away from the path and into the shadows of the wasteland. There, amidst the silence of the winter night, the peace of Uzunagach was shattered, though no one was close enough to hear. He used a knife, a tool he had mastered during his years of nomadic labor. The act was visceral, driven by a compulsion that had been simmering for years. He did not just take her life, he sought to consume the very essence of it. In the freezing cold, he crouched by the side of the road, hidden by the embankment, while a passing bus momentarily illuminated the snow nearby. He remained perfectly still, a phantom in the night, using the warmth of his victim to shield himself from the biting wind until the vehicle passed, and the darkness returned to claim the scene. The following morning, January 25th, the deceptive thaw continued. The sun rose, a pale, heatless disk in the gray sky, as a group of locals made a gruesome discovery near the riverbank. The remains of Nejda were found, partially hidden by the scrubland. The scene was one that the local authorities were entirely unprepared for. In the Soviet Union of 1979, such horrors were officially rare, almost non-existent in the public consciousness. The investigators moved through the snow with a sense of mounting dread, their breath huffing out in clouds as they documented the evidence. They found the discarded clothing, the disturbed earth, and the chilling evidence of a crime that went far beyond mere murder. There was a clinical, heavy silence as the realization set in that something ancient and predatory had entered their quiet community. The report was filed, the case was opened, but the name of the firefighter who had reported for duty that morning remained nowhere near the list of suspects. Nikolai went back to his work, his metal teeth glinting as he spoke to his colleagues, the taste of the hunt still fresh in his mind. As the news of the discovery trickled through Uzunagach, a shroud of unease settled over the village. Mothers held their children closer, and the evening walks that once felt peaceful now seemed fraught with hidden danger. The police investigation was quiet, hampered by the lack of witnesses and the sheer anomaly of the violence. They looked for outsiders, for drifters, for anyone who didn't fit the mold of a stable Soviet citizen. They did not look at the man who lived among them, the man who was currently planning his next move. The thaw of 1979 had released something from the frozen depths of Nikolai's psyche, and the winter was far from over. This first discovery was merely the opening note in a symphony of terror that would span the next 2 years. For now, the village tried to return to its rhythms, unaware that the shadow walking among them was growing longer with every passing sunset. The ice on the Uzunagach River remained thick, but beneath the surface, the currents were shifting, carrying the cold weight of a year that would change everything. Breathe deeply now. The story has only just begun to unfurl. In the vast, open reaches of the Kazakh steppe, the winter of 1979 arrived with a biting, relentless chill that seemed to seep through the very stones of the village. The sky hung low and heavy, a blanket of bruised purple and charcoal gray that pressed down upon the small village of Uzunagach. Here, where the horizon stretches until it meets the curvature of the earth itself, the silence is usually a comforting presence. But that January, the silence began to feel different. It was no longer the quiet of a sleeping landscape, but a hushed, expectant stillness, a breath held in the dark. The tall, dry grasses of the plains rattled against one another like brittle bones, whispering secrets that the villagers were not yet ready to hear. As the wind swept across the frozen ground, it carried with it the first traces of a shadow that would soon darken the history of the entire Soviet Republic. At the time, the world seemed stable, predictable, and governed by the rigid certainties of the state. No one could have known that a monster was already walking among them, blending into the gray background of everyday life. The first crack in the peace of the village appeared on a lonely stretch of road between Uzunagach and Mabulak. It was there that the body of a young woman named Nejda was discovered. She had been a member of a local religious group, a quiet soul who moved through the world with a gentle step. When she failed to return home, the initial concern was tempered by the hope that she had simply been delayed by the weather. But when the militia finally stood over the scene in the pale light of morning, the reality was beyond anything they had been trained to handle. The evidence was not merely violent, it was ritualistic, strange, and profoundly disturbing. The cold had preserved the scene in a haunting, crystalline state, making every detail stand out with terrifying clarity. Yet, the investigators found themselves looking through a lens of confusion. In the 1970s, the official stance was that such depravity was a symptom of Western decay, a sickness that could not possibly exist within the borders of their own socialist utopia. This ideological wall created a dangerous blind spot. Because a serial killer was, by definition, an impossibility in the Soviet Union, the militia looked for more conventional explanations. They focused their suspicions on Najda's church, wondering if some internal rift had led to her demise. They spent weeks questioning the faithful, searching for a motive that fit within their understanding of crime. Meanwhile, the real predator remained invisible. He was not a religious zealot. He was a local man who knew the paths of the steppe as well as he knew the rhythm of his own heart. The investigation stalled, the files growing thick with testimonies that led nowhere, while the winter wind continued to howl through the eaves of the village houses. The lack of a clear suspect allowed a quiet dread to ferment. In the markets and the communal kitchens, women began to speak in low voices about a figure they had seen on the periphery of their vision. A tall, well-dressed man who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost in the tall grass. As 1979 turned to 1980, rumors grew of a stranger with a smile that glinted in the moonlight. People spoke of a man who revealed teeth made of cold, white metal. These metallic fangs were an unsettling feature. They called him the Metal Fang. This man walked with a confident stride, often seen near the parks. He was clean-shaven, his clothes always neat. He was a firefighter, a man whose job was to protect. This mask was his weapon. It allowed him to move through the streets without a second glance, even as the missing persons list climbed. Women were vanishing into the landscape, leaving behind nothing but the cold wind. The mystery of the man with the steel smile became a weight the village carried through the long nights of 1980. Every creak of a floorboard or rattle of a shutter was now a potential threat. The authorities remained silent, their reports devoid of the word maniac, even as the shadow of Nikolai Dzhumagaliev grew longer and more ominous. The steppe, once a place of beautiful, open freedom, had become a labyrinth of hidden dangers, where a silver glint in the dark was the last thing many would ever see. The whispers continued, growing louder, as the people realized that the predator was not a ghost, but a neighbor. The spring of 1979 arrived in the foothills of the Almaty region with a deceptive gentleness. In the village of Uzunagach, the thaw was a slow process. Ice on the streams began to splinter, sounding like distant cracks in the quiet night. By April, the earth was moist, yielding under the boots of villagers moving between the market and their homes. There was a fragile peace, though the discovery made in January, a young woman found near the factory dump, still lingered in the back of everyone's minds like a cold draft. People spoke in low voices, ascribing the tragedy to a fluke, a lone predator who must have moved on. They wanted to believe their world was too small to harbor a monster. Anna Krieger was a woman who moved with a quiet grace. As a member of the Seventh-day Adventist community, she was dedicated to a peaceful life. On that evening in late April, she stayed late at her place of worship, her heart full of hymns and shared silence. As she stepped into the cool air, the sun was dipping behind the jagged teeth of the mountains, casting violet shadows across the steppe. She adjusted her wool coat, the fabric coarse against her skin, and began the walk home. The road was a dusty ribbon through the darkening landscape, flanked by tall grasses that hissed in the wind. She carried a small bag, its weight familiar, containing her things and the remnants of a meal. The landscape surrounding Uzunagach is a study in vastness. The sky weighs upon the earth, and the horizon feels unreachable. Anna's footsteps were the only sound in the twilight, a steady crunch of gravel. She was a woman of 70 years, her pace certain. She knew every turn in the road, every dip where shadows pooled. But that night, the silence felt different. It was not a peaceful stillness. It was heavy and expectant. The birds had stopped their chatter, and even the stray dogs were strangely quiet, tucked away in the crawlspaces of porches. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and the metallic tang of the coming night. She was nearing the stretch of road that led toward Mabulac. Behind dense shrubbery near that road, a figure waited. He was a man who prided himself on invisibility, blending into fire stations and local work crews. He was well-dressed, his face shaven, but beneath his lips he carried a secret. His missing teeth had been replaced with white metal dentures that caught what little light remained. He watched Anna approach, his heart beating with a predatory rhythm he had only recently discovered. He did not see a neighbor. He saw a target for the resentment he nursed against all women. The metal in his mouth felt cold, a stark contrast to the heat in his chest as he prepared to step out. To him, this was not a crime, but a hunt he had perfected. The transition from presence to absence happened in a heartbeat. There was no scream, no sound of a struggle that broke the evening's peace. There was only the sudden cessation of footsteps. A small scarf might have fluttered to the ground, its bright pattern a contrast to the dull browns of the earth. Back at Anna's home, the kettle sat on the stove, the water growing cold. A lamp burned in the window, a golden beacon meant to guide her, but it only illuminated an empty chair and an untouched book. The mundane details of a life interrupted are chilling. The half-peeled potato, the unmade bed, the clock ticking in a room that would remain empty for the rest of the night. When Anna did not return, the unease in Dzhumagaliev boiled over. Search parties fanned out by first light with lanterns and heavy sticks. They called her name into the mist, their voices echoing off the mountain walls, but only the wind answered them. They found small markers of a life snatched away, but the woman was gone, vanished into the indifferent landscape. The local police, still grappling with the January crime, were at a loss. There were no witnesses and no suspects. Whispers grew louder, speaking of a phantom with a steel smile, a creature that moved through the night without leaving a footprint. The mystery of the vanishing woman became a weight the village would carry through the long months. As days turned to weeks, habits changed. Doors were bolted at sunset. Women no longer walked the roads alone. The market became a place of hurried transactions and suspicious glances. Every stranger was a potential threat. The man with the metal teeth had claimed his second victim, and the peace of an entire community. The shadow of Nikolai Dzhumagaliev had stretched over Dzhumagaliev, and as 1979 progressed, that shadow would only grow darker. The village was no longer a sanctuary. It was a hunting ground. Somewhere in the quiet house of a local firefighter, the metal teeth were being cleaned, and the hunger was already beginning to return, sharper and more demanding than it had ever been before. The air in Alma-Ata during the late 1970s carried a specific weight. It was the scent of heavy mountain snow mixing with the sweet, overripe perfume of the vast apple orchards that gave the city its name. In those days, the streets were lined with towering poplars and the rhythmic hum of a Soviet capital finding its stride. Amidst this backdrop of order and industry, a man walked with a confidence that drew the eye, but never the suspicion of the local authorities. He was Nikolai Dzhumagaliev, and to those who encountered him in the market or on the city buses, he was the very picture of the new Soviet man. He was tall, physically imposing, and possessed a quiet intensity that many mistook for simple, hard-working dignity. To understand how he moved so freely through the shadows of the valley, we must peel back the layers of the persona he had so carefully constructed, the predator's mask that allowed him to blend into the daylight without a single ripple of alarm. Born in November of 1952 in the quiet village of Dzhumagaliev, Nikolai was the only son in a family of daughters. His father was Kazakh and his mother was Belarusian, a heritage that gave him a distinct, striking appearance that stood out in the crowds of the Almaty region. His childhood was, by all outward measures, unremarkable and peaceful. He was a boy who loved animals and showed no early signs of the darkness that would later define his legacy. When his time for mandatory military service arrived in 1970, he was assigned to the Chemical Defense Corps. He spent his days in Samarkand and Otter, learning the rigid disciplines of the Soviet army. The military shaped his body and his habits, instilling in him a love for cleanliness and a sharp, military bearing that he would maintain for the rest of his life. He returned to civilian life not as a troubled veteran, but as a man who seemed to value the structure of society, a man who knew how to follow orders, and more importantly, how to appear perfectly disciplined. After his discharge, a restless spirit took hold of him. He did not settle immediately back into the village life of his youth. Instead, Nikolai became a wanderer of the vast Soviet landscape. He traveled to the freezing ports of Murmansk and the distant reaches of Magadan, taking on roles as an electrician and a sailor. He saw the gray, churning waters of the northern seas and the industrial grit of the far-flung construction sites. This period of his life added a worldly charm to his character. When he eventually returned to the Almaty region in 1977, he carried the aura of a man who had seen the world. He was well-spoken and could share stories of his travels, making him an engaging presence at social gatherings. He found work at the local fire department and as a laborer on various construction sites. His colleagues respected him. He was known as a gold-handed worker, someone who could fix anything and who never shied away from the most difficult tasks. He was the neighbor you could rely on to mend a fence or share a cigarette in the cool evening air. There was one physical trait, however, that became his most recognizable feature. Years earlier, during a brawl, Nikolai had lost several of his front teeth. In their place, he had been fitted with dentures made of a bright, white metal. When he spoke or offered a polite smile, the silver flash of his teeth was impossible to miss. It was a detail that earned him the nickname Metal Fang among some circles, yet it didn't seem to detract from his appeal. On the contrary, he was considered handsome and was frequently seen in the company of women. He was always clean-shaven, his clothes were pressed, and he spoke with a softness that felt safe. This was the essence of the mask. He was the helpful fireman, the traveler with the metallic smile, and the dutiful son who had returned home to care for his family. He moved through the markets of Uzunagach and the parks of Alma-Ata with a sense of belonging that shielded him from any scrutiny. He was a part of the community's fabric, a thread so well integrated that no one could see the fraying edges of his mind. But beneath this polished exterior, the internal landscape was shifting into something unrecognizable. While working as a firefighter, a series of personal setbacks began to poison his worldview. He contracted several infections, illnesses he blamed entirely on the women he had encountered. This resentment did not manifest as outward aggression or public outbursts. Instead, it curdled into a cold, philosophical hatred. He began to view himself not as a member of society, but as a silent observer and, eventually, a judge. He started to formulate a twisted logic, seeing the world through a lens of extreme misogyny that justified his growing urges. He walked the same mountain paths as the hikers and the workers, but while they looked at the scenery, Nikolai was looking for vulnerabilities. He was studying the habits of the lone walkers and the timing of the buses. The man who had once been a protector of the community as a fireman was now using that same intimate knowledge of the city's rhythms to plan its deepest terrors. The mask was so perfect that even his closest friends could not see the predator staring back at them. As 1978 drew to a close, and the first snows of 1979 began to dust the peaks of the Alatau Mountains, the transformation was complete. The helpful neighbor and the reliable worker had vanished internally, replaced by a hunter who moved with calculated patience. He had spent years learning how to be invisible in plain sight, and now he was ready to test the strength of that invisibility. The first strike would come in January of 1979, a moment that would forever shatter the peace of the valley. But even as the first victim disappeared, the city looked for a monster in the shadows, never realizing that the monster was standing right beside them, smiling with a flash of white metal and offering a polite greeting in the morning light. The mask was held firmly in place, and the hunt had only just begun. The terror was no longer a distant rumor. It was a living, breathing neighbor, watching and waiting for the sun to set behind the jagged white peaks. In the silence of the winter night, the transition from worker to wolf was finally absolute, and the nightmare was about to take its first real shape. The year of 1979 was nearing its end, and the landscape near Alma-Ata had surrendered to a skeletal winter. In the outskirts of Uzunagach, the wind howled through mountain passes with a sound like a low, mournful flute. The ground was permafrost, a hard, unyielding crust that preserved everything it touched in a crystalline grip. For the local militia, winter usually meant minor thefts or accidents, but as December approached, a call came through that would alter their lives. They were summoned to a site near the riverbank, where the frost had partially thawed to reveal a sight that defied the logic of a typical criminal investigation. When the black Volga sedans stopped, the investigators stepped into air so cold it felt like inhaling glass. Their heavy wool coats offered little protection against the damp chill rising from the Uzunagach River. Leading the team was a senior investigator whose breath formed thick, white plumes as he surveyed the perimeter. The scene was bathed in the pale light of a winter afternoon, casting long shadows across the snow. There was a stillness here that felt unnatural, a silence so heavy that the mere crunch of a boot sounded like a gunshot. They moved toward the riverbank, scanning for anything that looked out of place in the pristine world. The forensic work began with a slow, rhythmic precision. Soviet investigators relied on their senses and the meticulous documentation of physical space. They didn't have digital tools, they had sketchpads, measuring tapes, and keen eyes. They moved in a line, marking the boundaries with wooden stakes. One officer knelt, his gloved fingers hovering above a set of footprints captured in the frozen mud. The prints were deep, suggesting a man of significant weight or someone carrying a heavy burden. As flashlights cut through the gloom, the light reflected off the ice, illuminating the grim expressions on their faces. They were searching for the why in the midst of the where. As they worked, the investigators noted a detail that troubled them. Scattered around the site were the victim's personal belongings. A small purse lay half-submerged in a drift of snow, its contents untouched. A silver brooch glinted in the light of a torch, still pinned to a scrap of fabric. In the eyes of the militia, this ruled out robbery. If the killer hadn't taken the valuables, then he was after something else. The senior investigator leaned in closer with his magnifying glass. He wasn't looking for gold. He was looking for the trajectory of the attack. What he found instead was a chilling lack of chaos. The scene suggested a predator who moved with terrifying efficiency. The most harrowing discovery came as the team began to examine the remains. The permafrost had acted as a natural preservative, keeping the evidence intact, but it could not hide the nature of the wounds. They were not the jagged marks of a struggle. Instead, they saw clean, purposeful incisions. As they documented the body, a heavy realization settled over the group. Large sections of tissue were missing, not torn away by wolves, but removed with a sharp blade. The hips and thighs had been expertly extracted. The militiamen looked at one another, the unspoken horror reflecting in their eyes. This was not just a killing, it was a harvest. The atmosphere shifted to a profound, bone-deep dread. One officer had to step away, his face turning the color of the snow. The idea of cannibalism belonged to dark legends, not to the modern Soviet world. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The killer had stayed long enough to perform a grisly dismemberment, perhaps even taking shelter nearby. They found a small depression in the brush where the snow had been matted down, as if someone had sat there for hours, watching and waiting. The senior investigator scribbled in his notebook, his hands shaking from the cold, or perhaps from the weight of the story he was beginning to piece together. As the sun dipped below the peaks, the militia packed their equipment. They left the riverbank, but the images remained etched into their minds. The investigation was no longer just about finding a murderer. It was about hunting a ghost who left traces of an impossible appetite. Somewhere in the vast, frozen landscape, a man was moving through the shadows, perhaps even watching the flickering lights of the town from the heights. The traces in the permafrost had provided the first glimpse into the soul of the monster, and the map they were drawing led directly into a darkness that no flashlight could pierce. For those who had seen the riverbank, the silence would never again be peaceful. The investigation did not move with the speed of modern forensics. It moved with the slow, methodical pace of a horse traversing a mountain pass. The militia, stationed in the Almaty region, felt the weight of the silence that followed the disappearances. The year was 1979, and as the winter began to release its grip on the valleys, the snow melted to reveal secrets that had been buried in the cold. Maps of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic were spread across desks, filled with the names of tiny settlements and winding rivers that seemed to disappear into the horizon. Every lead felt like a grain of sand. They were looking for a presence that moved through the thickets without leaving a footprint. Then, a whisper began to circulate among the villagers near Uzunagach. It was a description, a singular detail that cut through the fog of uncertainty. In the rural reaches of Kazakhstan, people began to speak of a man who did not fit the rhythm of the mountains. He was tall, unusually so, with a frame that suggested strength. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace that unsettled those who crossed his path. But it was not his height that remained etched in their memories. It was his smile. In the late 1970s, dental work often involved metal. But this man had a set of crowns made of a pale, white gold alloy that caught the light in a way that felt unnatural. When he spoke, the sun would glint off his mouth, creating a brief, blinding flash of cold metal. They began to call him the one with the metal teeth. This detail became the focal point of the militia's profile. Nikolai had lost his front teeth in a fight years prior, and the replacement white metal dentures gave him an appearance that was both striking and terrifying. He was valued by some for being clean-shaven and well-dressed, a man who could blend into a social gathering without raising alarm. Yet, in the isolation of the mountains, he was an anomaly. He wore military-style clothing, a remnant of his time in the Chemical Defense Corps, which allowed him to vanish into the scrubland and the shadows of the spruce trees. The militia struggled to reconcile the image of a polite worker with the evidence of the brutalist they sought, whose teeth shone like a predator in the dark. The geography of the region played into the hands of a predator. The Zalyiski-Alatau Mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky, their peaks dusted with white. Below them, the foothills were a labyrinth of deep ravines and dense forests. To search these woods was an exercise in futility without a specific target. The militia realized that the man they were seeking knew the land better than they did. He was a creature of the borders, living in the space between the village and the wild. Investigators spent long hours traveling between isolated farms, their jeeps bouncing over unpaved roads. They spoke to shepherds who saw things the rest of the world ignored. These men confirmed the presence of a tall wanderer who seemed to emerge from the mist and vanish just as quickly. The search narrowed, but the vastness of the Kazakh landscape remained a formidable enemy. Every ravine could hide a campsite, every cave could be a temporary home. The militia increased their patrols, their eyes scanning the tall grasses for any sign of a broad-shouldered man. They distributed sketches, though the technology of the time made them crude and haunting. The most prominent feature in every drawing was the mouth, a dark line where the white gold teeth were meant to be. The local population grew restless. Mothers kept their children closer to the hearth, and the once peaceful evening strolls through the villages ceased. The air felt heavy with the knowledge that someone was watching from the tree line. The metal teeth were no longer just a dental fix. They were the mark of a monster. The logistical nightmare of the 1980 investigation was compounded by the lack of centralized communication. Information traveled slowly from the remote outposts to the headquarters in Almaty. Often, by the time a report reached the desk of a senior officer, the trail had already gone cold. Yet, The persistence of the investigators was fueled by the sheer brutality of the crimes. They knew that the man with the gold teeth was not just a killer, but something much more predatory. They studied his movements, trying to predict where he might strike next. Slowly, the net began to tighten. The geography that had once protected him was now being mapped with intensity. The mountains were being watched. The rivers were being patrolled. And in the heart of the wilderness, the man with the golden teeth was beginning to feel the chase. As the winter of 1979 gave way to the frozen dawn of 1980, a peculiar silence settled over the Almoata region. The Kazakh steppe was a canvas of white, vast and unforgiving, where the wind carried whispers of things that should not exist in a modern, organized society. The investigators, working within the rigid structures of Soviet bureaucracy, found themselves chasing a phantom that left behind traces too horrific to speak of openly. The air was thick with a tension that surpassed the usual seasonal chill. It was the beginning of what locals would later call the season of blood, a time when the darkness did not just hide secrets, but seemed to consume them entirely. Every morning, as the sun rose over the Trans-Zili-Aladau Mountains, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, the fear grew. It was a fear not just of death, but of a specific kind of predation that defied the logic of the state. At the center of this gathering storm was a man whose very presence had become a localized legend of dread. Nikolai, a man once known for his clean-shaven face and well-dressed appearance, carried a secret behind his lips. Following a brawl years prior, his front teeth had been replaced with white metal dentures. In the dim light of the street lamps or the flicker of a match, these teeth would catch the light, a cold and unnatural glint that earned him the moniker of Metal Fang. This signature was not merely a physical deformity, it was a tool of terror. The investigators began to notice a pattern in the wounds found on the victims discovered near the rural paths. These were not the jagged marks of an animal, but the precise, calculated bite of something human, yet utterly detached from humanity. The metal teeth left a distinct impression, a metallic echo in the flesh that signaled a hunger far more profound than simple violence. The geographical spread of the crimes in early 1980 began to reveal a predatory logic. The Uzunagach Road, a vital artery connecting the smaller villages to the bustling heart of Almoata, became a hunting ground of terrifying efficiency. Here, the landscape was a blur of roadside shrubbery and deep ditches, perfect for a man who knew how to blend into the scenery. Nikolai would wait, sometimes for hours, watching the solitary figures of women walking between the settlements. He understood the rhythm of the buses and the timing of the shifts at the local factories. His first strike of the year occurred along this very highway, where the snow was deepest and the visibility poorest. The victim, often someone just trying to return home to the warmth of a family hearth, would find themselves suddenly confronted by a man who seemed helpful, even charming, until the moment the metal glinted in the dark. What made the 1980 spree particularly chilling was the meticulous nature of the dismemberment. Nikolai did not just kill, he processed. The investigators found evidence of a chillingly domestic approach to the aftermath of his crimes. He would carry the remains back to his home in his backpack, moving through the streets of Uzunagach with a calm that shielded him from suspicion. Inside his modest living quarters, the predator became a craftsman of the macabre. He used knives and axes with a familiarity that suggested a background in labor, perhaps a remnant of his time in the military or his work on the railways. The scent of wood smoke from his chimney often masked the more sinister smells emanating from his kitchen. He was a man who lived among his neighbors, greeting them in the mornings, while the remnants of his season of blood were stored within the very walls of his home. As the months of 1980 progressed, the radius of his activity expanded. He was no longer confined to the roadside. Reports began to surface of sightings in the dark ends of local parks and the wooded fringes of the city. The geographical spread was a testament to his confidence. He felt untouchable, emboldened by the slow-moving communication between the different police precincts. Each murder was a study in signature details: the drinking of blood, the specific removal of organs, and the ever-present mark of the metal teeth. The investigators were beginning to realize they were not looking for a common criminal, but a cannibalistic serial killer who viewed his victims as nothing more than biological resources. The weight of this realization began to crush the morale of the local authorities, who had no precedent for such a monster in their official records. The winter of 1980 was far from over. The winter of 1980 arrived in the Almaty region with a biting, crystalline clarity. The Alatau Mountains stood as silent, jagged sentinels against a sky the color of bruised slate, casting long, violet shadows that seemed to stretch across the plains like reaching fingers. In the small village, the air was so cold it felt brittle, as if the very breath leaving your lungs might shatter against the frozen earth. Yet, amidst this harsh and unforgiving landscape, there was one home that seemed to offer a peculiar, magnetic warmth. It was the house of Nikolai, a man known by his neighbors not as a predator, but as a gentleman of surprising hospitality. Inside those walls, the frost on the window panes created intricate, lace-like patterns, obscuring the view of the desolate world outside and trapping the heat of a crackling stove within. Nikolai moved through his domestic space with the practiced ease of a man who took pride in his environment. He was a laborer, a former firefighter, always neatly dressed and meticulously clean-shaven. When he smiled, the lamplight would catch the dull, silvered shimmer of his white metal teeth. To those who sat at his table, these metal prosthetics were merely a curiosity, a physical quirk of a man who had once been in a brawl and lost his natural smile. They did not see the Metal Fang described in the hushed rumors of the city. They saw a reliable friend who kept his boots polished and his house in order. He had cultivated a persona that was as smooth and cold as the mountain ice, a facade of normalcy that allowed him to walk among the innocent without raising a single alarm. The scent of his home was complex, a mixture of drying medicinal herbs and the heavy, savory aroma of slow-cooking meat. Nikolai was a skilled herbalist, and bundles of wild mint scent, John's wort, and sage hung from the rafters, their earthy perfume mingling with the steam rising from the pots on the stove. This sensory tapestry was comforting to his guests. They would stomp the snow from their heavy boots at the threshold, welcomed by the golden glow of the interior and the promise of a hot meal. He was a master of the traditional ethnic dishes of the region, spending hours over the preparation of stews and dumplings, his movements in the kitchen deliberate and almost rhythmic. The soft clinking of wooden spoons against ceramic bowls was the only music in the room, a domestic symphony that masked the silence of the surrounding wilderness. As December of 1980 progressed, Nikolai began to host more frequent gatherings. He invited friends, colleagues from the construction sites, and even casual acquaintances he had met while wandering the local parks. He was particularly attentive to his male friends, often encouraging them to bring their girlfriends or wives along. He played the part of the gracious host to perfection, pouring drinks with a steady hand and ensuring that every plate was piled high with food. There was a dark, hidden power in these moments that only Nikolai understood. He would sit back in the shadows of the room, his metal teeth glinting as he watched his guests feast on the elaborate meals he had prepared. He felt a twisted sense of superiority, a secret triumph that fueled his ego while his guests laughed and toasted to his health, entirely unaware of the true nature of the delicacies they were consuming. The hospitality was a shield, a way to hide the horrific reality of his private life in plain sight. Behind the heavy, white door of his refrigerator, and beneath the very floorboards where his guests rested their feet, lay the grisly evidence of his nocturnal excursions. The expanded radius of his activities throughout 1980 had provided him with a steady supply for his kitchen. He treated the processing of his victims with the same detached, professional precision he had used as a firefighter. To him, there was no distinction between the hunter and the cook. He viewed the world through a lens of profound disconnection, where the people he invited into his home were not human beings, but resources to be managed and consumed. The contrast between the jovial atmosphere of his dinner parties and the cold-blooded violence of his crimes was a chasm that only he could bridge. The atmosphere in the house during those mid-December nights was thick with a tension that none of the guests could quite name. Perhaps it was the way Nikolai would sometimes stare just a second too long at a guest's throat, or the way the house seemed to groan under the weight of its secrets whenever the wind died down. But the alcohol flowed freely, and the warmth of the stove was a powerful sedative against suspicion. Nikolai would speak of his time in the army or his knowledge of mountain flora, his voice a low, soothing baritone that lulled his visitors into a state of total security. He was a man who understood the architecture of trust, building it brick by brick with every shared drink and every bowl of stew, until the wall was high enough to hide the monster lurking behind it. Outside, the winter storms began to howl, piling drifts of snow against the side of the house until the windows were halfway buried. The world felt smaller, reduced to the circle of light around Nikolai's table. In this isolation, his hospitable facade became his entire reality. He had successfully integrated his darkest impulses into the mundane rituals of domestic life. The jars of medicinal plants on his shelves sat next to containers of salt and spices, a chilling domesticity that defied logic. He was a man who could discuss the healing properties of a root while planning the next addition to his pantry. As the calendar turned toward the 19th of December, 1980, the festive air in the hospitable house reached its peak, a final, flickering candle of normalcy before the darkness would finally be forced into the light. For now, the house remained a sanctuary of shadows. The guests would eventually leave, wrapping themselves in their wool coats and disappearing into the snowy night, waving goodbye to the polite man with the metal teeth. Nikolai would stand in the doorway, the yellow light from the hallway spilling out onto the pristine white snow, watching them go with a calm, predatory patience. He would then turn back inside, locking the door and beginning the silent work of cleaning his kitchen, the silver of his teeth catching the moonlight as he moved through the quiet rooms. The facade was holding, the secrets were safe, and the winter of 1980 continued its frozen march toward a conclusion that no one in that small village could have ever imagined. The winds of late December 1980 howled through the narrow, unpaved streets of the village of Uzunagach, carrying the biting chill of the Alatau Mountains. It was a season of deep frosts and long, suffocating nights, where the world seemed to contract into small, dimly lit interiors. Within the modest walls of Nikolai's home, however, there was a fire burning and the intoxicating scent of a rich, savory meat. He had extended an invitation to several of his acquaintances, a gesture of hospitality that seemed to soften his reputation as a solitary and eccentric figure. The guests arrived wrapped in heavy wool coats, their breath visible in the freezing air until they crossed the threshold into the amber glow of his small dwelling. They shook the snow from their boots, unaware that the warmth they sought was merely a shroud for something unspeakable. Inside, the table was set with a deceptive generosity. On the stove, a large pot simmered, releasing clouds of steam that smelled of salt, pepper, and slow-cooked meat. Nikolai served his guests with a steady hand, placing generous portions of what he claimed was fresh mutton before them. He spoke of the difficulty of finding such quality meat during the lean winter months, and his guests, hungry and grateful, began to eat. The sound of metal spoons clinking against ceramic bowls filled the quiet intervals of their conversation. They praised the meal, noting the richness of the broth and the tender texture of the meat. Little did they know, the traditional recipes Nikolai prepared were seasoned with a horror that no spice could ever fully mask. Nikolai himself sat at the head of the table, his demeanor calm and oddly elegant. He watched his guests with a piercing, unblinking intensity, his own plate remaining largely untouched. Occasionally, the flickering candlelight would catch the glint of his teeth. Those strange, cold replacement fangs crafted from white metal that earned him the whispered moniker of the Metal Fang. He was a well-dressed and clean-shaven host, projecting an air of civility that stood in sharp contrast to the predatory nature hidden beneath his skin. He spoke little, but his presence was a heavy weight in the small room. He seemed to be savoring not the food, but the secret of the meal itself, watching the realization remain just out of reach for his unsuspecting companions. The radio in the background played a faint, melodic folk tune, the strings of the instrument vibrating softly against the heavy, grease-laden atmosphere. The walls were adorned with simple decorations, but the guests found their eyes drawn repeatedly to the kitchen doorway, where the light was even dimmer. There was a peculiar dampness in the air, a metallic tang that the smell of the stew could not entirely hide. As the evening progressed and the spirits flowed, the initial joviality began to fray at the edges. One of the guests, a man who had known Nikolai for some time, felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of unease. He looked at the meat on his plate, noting its fine grain and pale fat, which seemed different from any mutton he had ever seen. Seeking a moment of air, or perhaps just to refill a glass, one of the guests rose and wandered toward the back of the house. The kitchen was a place of cold stone and utilitarian shadows, where a single bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly in a draft. On the counter lay a heavy knife, its edge polished to a mirror finish. The air here was much colder, the heat of the stove failing to reach the far corners where the storage bins sat. The guest moved toward the wash basin, but his gaze was pulled toward a large, galvanized container tucked beneath the wooden preparation table. He leaned down, thinking perhaps there was more drink or a cache of winter vegetables stored away. As he pulled back the covering, the world tilted. There, resting in the frozen dimness, was the unmistakable shape of a human head, accompanied by the sight of intestines and a severed hand. The guest did not scream at first. The shock was too profound, a physical blow that robbed him of his breath. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the gruesome contents, while the sounds of the dinner party continued in the next room, the soft music and the clatter of silverware. When he finally stumbled back into the living room, his face was the color of wood ash. He could not speak, only point toward the kitchen with a trembling hand. The others fell silent, the laughter dying in their throats as they looked from their friend to Nikolai. The host did not move. Nikolai sat perfectly still, his metal teeth bared in a thin, grotesque sliver of a smile, finally allowing the mask of the gentleman to slip away. Chaos erupted as the realization hit them like a tidal wave. The guests scrambled for the door, knocking over chairs and spilling the remains of the dinner across the floor. They ran into the night, their boots crunching on the snow, headed for the local police station in a state of pure panic. Left alone in the wreckage, Nikolai remained seated for a moment longer. He looked at the empty chairs and the flickering candlelight. Then, with a calculated and terrifying calmness, he rose, grabbed a hatchet, and stepped out into the shadows of the mountains. By the time authorities arrived, the man had vanished. The guests did not look back. Their boots hammered against the hard-packed snow, each breath a ragged plume in the biting air of December 18, 1980. Behind them, the house in Uzunagash grew smaller, but the image of what they had seen in that kitchen remained etched into their minds. They had arrived expecting a dinner party with the polite Nikolai. Instead, they had found the unthinkable. The transition from host to creature of nightmares was instantaneous. As they reached the village road, their screams were swallowed by the frozen silence of the Kazakh night. They ran until their lungs burned, fueled by the primal instinct to put distance between themselves and the man with the metal teeth. When the authorities arrived at the residence, the air was heavy with the scent of iron. The local police were unprepared for the sight that greeted them. In the kitchen, The reality of Nikolai's secret life lay bare. It was a scene of terrifying precision that defied the quiet dignity of the snowy landscape. One officer would later recall the paralyzing shock that took hold. It was in this momentary lapse that Nikolai saw his opportunity. He did not plead or surrender. Instead, he threw himself through the window, the glass shattering like ice, and disappeared into the blackness of the mountain foothills. He was gone before a single hand could reach for a holster, fleeing into the freezing dark. Nikolai ran into the frost with speed born of years spent hunting. He moved through the drifts with a fluid grace, his body seemingly immune to the plummeting temperatures. In his hand, he gripped the hatchet, a cold weight that had become an extension of his own arm. He was reportedly naked, stripped of his persona as he embraced the raw elements. Behind him, the village began to stir, lanterns flickering to life. But ahead of him lay the mountains, the ancient sentinels of the Alatau Range. To Nikolai, this was not a hostile wasteland. It was his sanctuary. He knew the hidden ravines and the caves where the wind could not reach. As he climbed higher, the lights of the world he had discarded faded into a dim glow. The manhunt was a slow, agonizing process. The police, reinforced by volunteers, fanned out across the base of the mountains. Their flashlights were mere pinpricks against the oppressive darkness, sweeping over gnarled trees and jagged rock faces. The sound of the pursuit was a rhythmic crunching of snow, a sound that Nikolai listened to from the heights. He watched them like a predator watching its own hunters. The officers struggled. The frost seeped through their wool coats and numbed their fingers. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices carried away by the whistling wind. Every shadow seemed to shift, and every snap of a branch sounded like the approach of the man they called the Metal Fang. The fear was of what he represented, a soul gone completely adrift in the wild. Throughout the night of December 18 and into the morning of the 19, the search intensified. The authorities were desperate. They knew that if he escaped into the deeper reaches of the mountains, he might never be found. He was a man who could survive on the land, having proven his ability to live outside the boundaries of civilization. Dogs were brought in, their muzzles frosted with ice as they caught the faint scent of blood and sweat. The trail led away from the house, weaving through the outskirts of the village toward the home of a relative. It was there, in the early light of dawn, that the circle began to close. The hunter was cornered, but even in his exhaustion, he remained a figure of terrifying composure. When they finally found him at his cousin's house on December 19, 1980, the confrontation was quiet. The fire in his eyes had not dimmed, but the physical toll of the night in the frost was visible. He stood in the doorway, the morning light catching the glint of the metal in his mouth, as he offered that same thin sliver of a smile. There was no grand struggle or final act of defiance. He simply stepped forward into the waiting hands of the law, leaving behind a trail of terror that would haunt Kazakhstan for decades. The manhunt was over, but the true investigation into his depravity was only just beginning. As they led him away, the mountains remained silent, the snow falling softly to cover the tracks of the monster who had walked among them. The air inside the interrogation room was heavy, thick with the scent of iron and the cold, unyielding reality of the law. Nikolai sat with a stillness that was deeply unsettling, his hands finally resting on the wooden table, no longer reaching for the knives or the shadows of the Almaty outskirts. After the chaotic events of December 19, 1980, where he had briefly vanished into the mountains while naked and armed with a hatchet, the authorities had finally secured him at his cousin's home. The silence that followed his capture was not the silence of peace, but a heavy, expectant void. The investigators, their eyes weary from the hunt, watched him through a haze of cigarette smoke, trying to reconcile the polite, well-dressed man before them with the visceral horrors they had discovered in his kitchen. It was as if the vast, lonely steppe had somehow condensed all its ancient, primal cruelty into the frame of a single man. And now, trapped within 4 gray walls, that cruelty had nowhere left to go. As the evidence was catalogued, the true nature of his crimes began to emerge in a series of stomach-churning revelations. The officers who had first entered his home were haunted by the sights they found there. The metal tools, the white metal dentures that earned him the nickname Metal Fang, and the domestic preparations of a man who viewed his fellow humans as nothing more than prey. During the trial, which formally commenced on December 3, 1981, the court heard testimony that sounded like a dark folklore. Nikolai spoke of his victims with a chilling detachment, describing his actions as a mission to cleanse the world. He was charged with the murders of 7 women, though the whispers of the region suggested the number could be much higher, perhaps 9 or even 10. His teeth, forged from a cold, silver-white metal, glinted under the courtroom lights as he recounted the banquets he had hosted, where friends were unknowingly served a horrific and forbidden fare. The physical reality of his violence was so extreme that it left the Soviet legal system grasping for a way to categorize a soul that seemed so fundamentally fractured. The medical experts at the Serbsky Institute were tasked with looking into the abyss of his mind. They observed the way he spoke of the mountains and the rivers with more affection than he did the lives he had extinguished. Their findings were eventually summarized in a diagnosis that offered a clinical label for his darkness: paranoid schizophrenia. Because of this, he was declared legally insane, a verdict that meant he would not face a firing squad, but would instead be committed to the high-security psychiatric facility in Tashkent. For the families of the victims, this was a hollow victory. The man who had terrorized the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic was now a patient, hidden away behind whitewashed walls and heavy iron doors. For 8 long years, the name Nikolai Dzhumagaliev became a ghost story, a memory that people tried to bury under the daily routines of Soviet life, hoping that the specialized treatments and the passage of time would keep the predator contained forever. However, the containment was not as absolute as the public had been led to believe. On August 29, 1989, while he was being transferred between facilities in a secure vehicle, the system failed. Nikolai managed to slip his bonds and vanish into the late summer heat. For 2 years, the Soviet authorities kept the escape a secret, fearing the panic it would ignite across the republic. While the people of Almaty walked their streets unaware, the Metal Fang was a shadow once more. It is believed he survived by retreating into the familiar solitude of the mountains, perhaps crossing into Kyrgyzstan, where he lived as a hermit and a gatherer of medicinal herbs. The thought of him roaming free during those 24 months is a chilling coda to his legend, a reminder of how easily the most dangerous among us can blend back into the natural world, becoming just another ripple in the grass or a rustle in the trees. The hunt finally ended in April 1991, not with a dramatic shootout, but with a simple act of theft. In the Fergana region of Uzbekistan, a man was caught trying to steal a sheep. When questioned, he claimed to be a Chinese citizen, but his lack of documentation and his peculiar demeanor raised the suspicions of the local police. When the detectives from Moscow arrived to verify his identity, they found themselves staring into the eyes of the most notorious cannibal in their history. Nikolai was recaptured and returned to the psychiatric system, eventually being moved to a specialized clinic in the village of Aktas, located in the Almaty region. There, the man who once hunted the steppe found a different kind of life. Behind the barbed wire of the facility, he began to spend his days in quiet labor, repairing small electronic equipment and clocks, his once violent hands now busy with the delicate work of gears and wires. Today, Nikolai remains a permanent resident of that clinic in Aktas. He is described by the staff as a calm, elderly man who plays chess and follows the rules of the ward. Yet the shadow he cast over the 1980s never truly dissipated. His presence in the village, even behind guarded walls, remains a source of deep unease for the locals. They remember the stories of the metal teeth and the dinners in the dark. The diagnosis of the steppe remains unfinished, a testament to the fragile line between the civilized world and the primal instincts that can take root in the isolation of the plains. The case of the Almaty cannibal serves as a somber reminder of the monsters that can walk among us, hidden behind a polite smile and a well-pressed suit. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.